Greetings, YouTube. As I mentioned in a previous video, I sketch weapons as a hobby. I realize it's a narrow topic, but I've always been attracted to weapons. As a child, my interest was based around the fact that I was afraid. I felt I needed to be protected. But over time, my interest in weapons expanded. Now, not only do I sketch weapons, but I collect them, and I have a large collection of books concerning weapons, both general reference books and academic texts. In fact, my collection of reference books and texts is larger than my local city library. And over the course of all my reading, I've come to three main myths that seem to be perpetrated in the Western mind. Myths about weapons that are so prevalent that people don't even realize they're myths anymore. The first being the katana. The Japanese katana, also known as the samurai sword. The katana is given all kinds of mystical abilities because it's so special. Now don't get me wrong, the art forging a katana, or any Japanese blade, wakizashi, tanto, etc., is an art form, and the people who do this are justifiably lauded as artists. But they're very, very finely tuned items, these swords. A thumbprint can rust them. They can, in fact, be damaged. They don't cut through machine guns, as one myth that was running around the world during World War II said they could. In fact, the Mythbusters even did a segment on that. But they are beautiful, and for the style of combat they were designed for, they were excellent. One of the other myths I've heard is that European smiths were clods, essentially banging out iron bars that were used to club people to death. Well, that isn't entirely true. European smiths were very good. They may not have quite reached the levels of expertise that the Japanese smiths did, but they came very close. Part of that, I think, is the fact that the European culture, while they venerated this sword, they didn't have quite the cult wrapped around it that developed in ancient Japan. But there are many fine examples of European weapons crafted in period and currently. And my last big myth that has always bothered me is the weight of weapons. This, I think, is caused by the fact that lots of European weapons didn't survive into our era, and because they were used and reused. I know at the end of the cavalry era, the U.S. government took all of their cavalry swords, sold them off, and its knife manufacturer bought some, cut them up, and made blades out of them. So the swords became knives. In fact, there are actually people who collect the swords, collect these knives, and can essentially rebuild a virtual sword out of the knives. It's kind of interesting. So the European weapons, without the cult of the sword wrapped around them that the Japanese had, tended to see lives after use as a weapon. Which, kind of makes sense. It's a good piece of steel. A good piece of steel can be used for many purposes besides killing someone. But another reason it is that, and this is probably going to seem strange for people who don't play role-playing games, is that the people who design role-playing games, particularly the classic Dungeons & Dragons, have never had a clue about how weapons are actually designed or how much they weigh. In America, there's a man known as Tom Merringer. He's quite possibly the greatest living swordsmith on the continent. He once had someone order a sword from him with a blade with a spine thickness, that's the thickest point of the blade, 1¼ inch thick. He thought he misheard the man and thought the man wanted a 1/4 inch thick. No, the man wanted a blade that was 1.25 inches thick. That's that thick. That's a crowbar. That's not a sword. The man said he wanted a big, strong sword. Well, he wasn't looking for a sword. He was looking for an art object, because that would never be a weapon. A lot of the big swords you see in museums survived into our current era because they were never designed as weapons. They were designed as showpieces, literal wall hangers. Weapons that would be paraded around as a symbol of a knight or a lord's might, but never actually used in combat, because you couldn't swing the things. As Tom Marriger once said, a two-handed sword that weighs more than 6 pounds is absurd. And he's right. And that's a sword that's going to have a blade 5 feet long. It doesn't have to be heavy. All it has to do is be well made, well balanced, and properly tuned to its task. I have an acquaintance of mine in the Society for Creative Anachronism who once commented that a polearm, and in the SCA a polearm is a 6-foot weapon, a polearm is a 6-foot scalpel in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. And he's right. A large weapon, well suited to the person using it, is deadly. And two-handed swords used in period were often used more along the lines as a polearm than strictly as you see them portrayed in films. You would make strikes with the pommels, the base of the sword, you would make strike with the guards. You might even reverse the sword, hold it by the blade, and hook someone's leg with the guard. Not necessarily a very traditional style, but if it got the guy down on the ground where you could kill him, it worked. My fascination for weapons pretty much knows no bound. I mean, I do sketch them on a regular basis just for fun. But I always try to make my sketches be somewhat believable. Yes, they can be fantastic in design. I often design weapons that are based on fantasy races, such as the dwarves, or gnomes, or elves. Elves are very popular. But I try to make them look like they could function. Like if this were to somehow be made into the real world in a three-dimensional object, you could pick it up, you could use it, and it wouldn't just be a rock. Weapons have always been a part of our culture. Before our culture, our hominid ancestors made spears and stone tools for 2 million years now. I just happen to be fascinated by their use today, whether it's the stone tools being made by those doing flint knapping or the latest advances in firearms. And there are people still making hand weapons in new and interesting designs. Particularly, tomahawks are being used by special forces again. Have been since Vietnam, and that always makes me smile. But I love weapons, and I just wish that the myths around them were a little less fantastic.